The heavy, rhythmic thrum of the atmosphere scrubbers in the lower sectors of the ossuary was a sound Elias Thorne felt in his marrow. It was not the clean, clinical hum of the core worlds. It was a wet, laboring cough of a station that had been dying for 100 years. Elias sat in a booth at the ribcage, a tavern literally carved into the petrified jawbone of the ancient Leviathan that housed their civilization. The walls were ivory white and cold to the touch, smelling faintly of stale synthetic ale and the metallic tang of recycled oxygen. He checked his wrist unit, 1900 hours and 12 minutes. "You're fidgeting again, Elias," a voice chirped in his ear. It was Lyra, sounding far too smug for a 16-year-old currently hiding in their apartment 3 levels up. "Your heart rate is up to 85 beats per minute. Relax. You look like a man waiting for a firing squad instead of a beautiful woman." Elias tapped the comm bead tucked into his ear canal. "I am a man waiting for a catastrophic lapse in judgment, Lyra. Why am I here? I have a wounded Sky Ray back at the clinic that needs a fluid change every 2 hours. I don't have time for matchmaking algorithms." "The Sky Ray is fine, Dad. I checked its vitals through the remote link," Lyra countered. He could almost hear her rolling her eyes. "Uncle Jax paid for a 6-month premium subscription to the Convergence Path. He said if you didn't go on at least one date, he'd start bringing potential suitors to the clinic during surgery. Think of the hygiene risks." Elias sighed, a sound that disappeared into the cacophony of the bar. Around him, a dozen different species mingled under the flickering amber lights. Hulking Ursa miners traded stories of deep-veined crystalline deposits, while lithe, 4-armed scavengers gambled with rusted credits. Elias felt like a ghost among the living. He was a veteran of the border wars, a combat medic who had seen too many bodies stitched back together only to fall apart again. His heart had been a closed circuit since the day the shuttle carrying his wife, Sarah, had vanished into the synaptic veil 5 years ago. "2 more minutes, Lyra," Elias muttered. "If she doesn't show by 1915, I am going home to my lizards and my solitude." "Hold the line, soldier," she whispered. "Destiny is rarely early." At exactly 1900 hours and 14 minutes, the air pressure in the room shifted. It was a subtle change, the kind a man only noticed if he had spent years listening for the hiss of a breaching hull. The loud chatter of the Ursa miners died down. The gamblers froze. 2 figures moved through the crowd with a predatory grace that made the other patrons scatter like startled baitfish. They were Leonians, feline humanoids from the Lyra Siren sector. The one on the left was tall, her fur a midnight black that seemed to swallow the dim light of the tavern. She wore a tattered tactical cloak, but Elias could see the matte gray plating of combat armor beneath it. Her golden eyes were slitted, scanning the room with a lethality that made Elias's hand instinctively twitch toward the empty holster at his hip. The second Leonian was shorter, her fur a mix of tawny gold and cream. She looked softer, but the way she kept her hand near the hilt of a curved pulse blade suggested otherwise. But it wasn't the 2 warriors that made Elias's breath catch. It was the train of small, shivering shadows following in their wake. 5 children, 3 Leonian kits with oversized ears and wide, terrified eyes, and 2 human children, a boy and a girl, clinging to the cloaks of their guardians. They were dressed in mismatched rags, their faces smeared with the gray soot of the industrial levels. The black-furred Leonian, Kalen, locked eyes with Elias. It was a physical impact, a target lock that felt like a cold needle in his chest. They didn't stop at the bar. They marched straight to his booth. Kalen didn't offer a greeting. She didn't apologize for the intrusion. She simply swept her arm out, herding the 5 children into the small semicircular bench. "Sit," she commanded, her voice a low, melodic rasp that sounded like gravel sliding over silk. The children scrambled, squeezing into the space meant for 2 people. A small human boy with messy dark hair jammed his elbow into Elias's ribs. A Leonian kit with 1 notched ear crawled under the table and began investigating Elias's boots. Elias looked at the chaos. He looked at Kalen, who was now looming over him like a storm cloud. "I think there's been a massive error in the sorting algorithm," he said, his voice dry. "The reservation was for a quiet drink and perhaps a conversation about shared interests." "Soin-tui," Kalen ignored him. She reached into the folds of her cloak and pulled out a heavy, rectangular block of obsidian-colored data crystal. It was old-world tech, military grade, the kind of hardware used for high-security ghost logic encryption. She slammed it onto the table with a thud that made Elias's water glass rattle. "Elias Thorne," Kalen said. It wasn't a question. "Maybe," Elias replied, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" "The protocol." "The Golden Leonian," Vanya whispered. She stepped forward, her tawny tail flicking anxiously. Beneath the grime, Elias could see the deep lines of exhaustion on her face. "We ran the search parameters through every hub from here to the core. We filtered 4 billion profiles. We looked for a specific biometric resonance, a psychological profile capable of high-stress guardianship, and a medical background in multi-species trauma." She pointed a clawed finger at the data block. "You are the match." Elias stared at the crystal. Above it, a holographic projection flickered to life. It didn't show a dating profile. It showed his own face, a younger version from his time in the border wars, and a rotating DNA helix that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic blue light. Below the image, in flashing crimson letters, were the words, "Primary Guardian. Candidate confirmed." Elias felt a cold sweat break across his forehead. "I am a vet," he sputtered. "I fix broken wings on exopets. I don't do children, or whatever this is. You have the wrong guy." "The machine lacks the capacity for error," Kalen said coldly. "We do not have time for your self-doubt, human." "Dad?" Lyra's voice buzzed in his ear, breathless and high-pitched. "Dad, don't you dare hang up. This is getting incredibly interesting. Are those alien kittens?" "They are a complication, Lyra," Elias muttered. "Are you talking to yourself?" the human girl sitting across from him asked. She looked to be about 8 years old with sharp eyes that reminded him painfully of Sarah. "Because that's a sign of neuroinstability. We need stability." Elias looked at the girl. Her name tag, pinned crookedly to her oversized tunic, read, Nova. "I am talking to my daughter," Elias said, "who is currently far away, where you should be." "We don't have a where," Nova said matter-of-factly. "We have a file, and we have you. Are you going to feed us?" "Ren is hungry. He started trying to eat the table." Elias looked down. The smallest Leonian kit was indeed gnawing on the edge of the petrified bone table. "I'm not feeding anyone," Elias said, panic beginning to claw at his chest. He started to stand up. "I'm leaving. This is a scam or a prank, or a very elaborate way to dump orphans on a stranger." "If you walk out that door, Elias Thorne," Kalen said, her voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated with a hidden threat, "they will be dead by sunrise, and so will we." Elias froze. He looked closer at Kalen. The heavy cloak she wore wasn't just for style. On her left shoulder, the fabric was scorched, the fibers fused together by a high-heat plasma graze. On Vanya's sleeve, there was a dark, wet patch that hadn't dried yet. They weren't just tired. They were bleeding. "Why me?" Elias asked, his voice dropping to match hers. The soldier in him was waking up, shaking off 5 years of dust. He scanned the room, no longer looking for an exit, but for threats. "Because," Vanya whispered, leaning in from the other side, "the file isn't just a record. It's a key. And the person who wrote the encryption, she said you were the only one who could hold the line." The holographic display shifted. The DNA helix vanished, replaced by a string of coordinates and a timestamp from 5 years ago. Elias's heart stopped. Those coordinates were the last known location of Sarah's shuttle. Suddenly, the music in the ribcage cut out. It was replaced by a high-pitched, dissonant chime. The amber lights didn't dim. They changed spectrum, shifting into a harsh, clinical white scanning grid that swept across the patrons. Elias knew that grid. It was a biometric sweep, high-frequency, military-grade. "Dr. Thorne," the station AI announced pleasantly over the speakers. "Security sweep in progress. Please remain seated for identity verification." It was a lie. The station didn't do sweeps in the middle of a commercial cycle. Elias looked at the entrance. 4 men had entered. They wore the nondescript gray armor of private security contractors, veins erasers. But they moved with the precision of a liquidation squad. They were checking faces. They were looking for 7 specific heat signatures. "They found us," Vanya gasped, her ears flattening completely. Who found you? Elias asked. The men who want the children erased, Kaylin said. She reached for a weapon beneath her cloak, but Elias's hand shot out and clamped over her wrist. No, Elias ordered. His voice was no longer dry, it was steel. You draw a weapon in here, the ceiling turrets will shred us before you clear the holster. There are civilians everywhere. They will take the kids as collateral. Kaylin snarled, her pupils dilating into black discs. Then what? Then we move, Elias said. He tapped his earbead. Lyra, I need a route. Access the service schematics for the ribcage. I need a way out that doesn't involve the front door or a body bag. On it, Dad, Lyra said, her voice instantly losing its playful tone. Kitchens are to your back right. There's a refuse chute that connects to the sub-level maintenance tunnels. It's going to smell like a dead Leviathan's gut, but it's clear of sensors. We're past caring about the smell, Elias said. He stood up, grabbing the data block from the table and shoving it into his coat pocket. Everyone up, now. Are we getting protein bars? Ren, the hungry Leonian boy, asked. We're getting out, Elias said. He looked at Nova. You, take the little one's hand. Don't let go. If he stops, you drag him. Understood? Nova nodded, her face solemn. She grabbed the hand of the smallest human toddler, Pip, who was staring at the white scanning lights in a trance. Move, Elias commanded. He didn't know these women. He didn't know these kids. But as he steered them toward the kitchen doors, pushing through a crowd of panicked dancers, a familiar heavy weight settled in his gut. It was the weight of a mission. Medical emergency, Elias barked as a patron tried to block his way. Contagious fungal outbreak. Very itchy. Move. The crowd parted instantly. They burst into the kitchen, a chaotic symphony of sizzling pans and shouting droids. Elias didn't stop to explain. He led the group past the industrial ovens to a heavy blast door marked Waste Disposal, Authorized Personnel Only. He slammed his hand on the keypad. It denied him. Lyra! Bypassing. 3, 2, 1. Lyra counted down. The light turned green. The door hissed open, revealing a dark, cavernous tunnel that smelled of recycled air and old grease. In, Elias said. Kaylin hesitated, looking into the darkness. This is a garbage chute. It's a tactical egress point, Elias corrected. Go! He shoved them inside and followed, sealing the door just as the kitchen entrance behind them burst open. Through the small, reinforced viewing port, he saw the gray-armored men storm in, rifles raised. They were safe for exactly 30 seconds. Elias turned to the group huddled in the dark. The blue light of the data crystal in his pocket pulsed against his hip, a steady, haunting heartbeat. Welcome to the family, he whispered to the shadows. Try not to die on the first day. The tunnel was wide enough for 3 people to walk abreast, but the ceiling was low, forced down by the massive, calcified ribs of the station. Emergency strips on the floor provided the only light, a faint, rhythmic amber pulse that made the shadows of the children dance against the walls. Keep moving, Elias said, taking the lead. He held his medical scanner in one hand, using its low-range sonar to map the turns ahead. We need to get to the marrow sectors. My clinic is on the outer rim of the eye socket. If we can get there, I have heavy blast shutters and an atmospheric seal that can withstand a vacuum breach. You have a fortified perimeter? Kaylin asked, falling into stride beside him. She was limping slightly now, her left leg stiff. I have a temperamental security system and a very protective daughter, Elias replied. He glanced back. Vanya was carrying the toddler, Pip, while Nova and the 3 Leonian kits, Ren, Tally, and Jax, huddled close together. They were surprisingly quiet. It was the quiet of children who had spent their short lives learning that noise brought pain. That realization made a cold knot form in Elias's stomach. As a medic, he had treated plenty of war orphans, but there was something different about these 5. They didn't look like they were just running from a war. They looked like they were running from a laboratory. Who are you people? Elias asked, his breath hitching as they climbed a steep incline. And don't give me that match garbage again. I want the truth. Why are the erasers hunting a group of children in the middle of a civilian station? Kaylin's golden eyes flashed in the dark. We are caretakers, Thorne. We worked at the sanctuary on Ethelgard. It was supposed to be a neutral zone for multi-species refugees. But 3 weeks ago, High Proctor Vane issued a biological optimization order. Optimization? Elias felt the bile rise in his throat. He knew that corporate speak. It was a euphemism for liquidation. He claimed the Leonian kits were a drain on resources, Kalen hissed. He claimed their biology was incompatible with the new labor quotas. But it was a lie. He didn't want to feed them. He wanted to study them. He's looking for something in their genetic code. Something Sarah found first. Elias stopped dead. The name hit him like a physical blow. Sarah? You mean Sarah Thorne? My wife? Kalen stopped too. She reached out and grabbed his arm, her claws digging into his leather jacket. She wasn't just a pilot, Elias. She was a courier for the underground. She spent the last year of her life smuggling data out of Vane's private servers. She's the one who created the legacy protocol. She's the one who chose you. She's dead, Elias said, his voice shaking. Her shuttle went down in the Veil. There was no debris, no survivors. She knew the risks, Vanya added softly from behind them. She told us that if she didn't make it, the protocol would trigger a search. It took 5 years for the encryption to settle, for the right coordinates to align. It waited until we were desperate enough to find you. I'm a vet, Elias repeated, though the words felt hollow now. I'm not a revolutionary. I don't have a ship. I don't have an army. You have a biometric signature that unlocks the second layer of that crystal, Kalen said, and you have a clinic. Right now, that's all the army we need. Dad! Lyra's voice crackled over the comms, distorted by the depth of the tunnels. You've got company. 2 eraser drones just entered the ventilation shaft 40 meters above you. They're tracking your heat signatures. You need to ghost now. Understood, Elias said. He looked at the group. New plan. We're taking the coolant lines. It'll be freezing, but it'll mask our thermal output. Nova, grab a thermal blanket from my bag. Wrap it around the little ones. They scrambled into a secondary pipe, the air instantly dropping 20 degrees. The children whimpered as the cold bit into their skin, but they didn't scream. Elias felt a surge of respect for them. They were survivors. They moved in silence for 20 minutes, winding through the complex architecture of the ossuary's bones. They passed through a hydroponics bay that smelled of damp earth and synthetic fertilizer, then through an old ore processing plant where the dust was so thick it tasted like iron. Finally, they reached a heavy circular hatch. This is it, Elias whispered. He placed his palm against the scanner. Cade Thorne, Protocol 0. The hatch hissed open. They stepped into a clean, sterile environment that smelled of antiseptic and ozone. It was a small, repurposed cargo container filled with exam tables, jars of multi-species antibiotics, and several large cages containing his current patients, a 3-legged lizard and a very grumpy, glowing owl. Close the shutters, Lyra, Elias commanded. With a thunderous clang, heavy durasteel plates slid down over the windows and the main airlock. The clinic was sealed. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the heavy breathing of the 8 refugees. Elias leaned his back against the door, sliding down until he hit the floor. He looked at his new pack. Kalen was already scanning the room for exits. Vanya was checking the kits for frostbite. Nova was looking at the jars of animal treats on the counter. Welcome to Thorne Veterinary Services, Elias rasped. No questions asked, though I think I'm going to have to break my own rule tonight. Dad! A door at the back of the clinic flew open. Lyra stormed in, her dark hair a mess of static and her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and excitement. She was carrying a data pad that was scrolling rapid-fire news feeds. She stopped dead in the center of the room. She looked at the Leonian warriors. She looked at the pile of children. She looked at Elias, who was covered in grease and bleeding from his shoulder. You actually did it, Lyra said. Her voice was uncharacteristically quiet. I didn't do anything, Elias said defensively. They followed me home. It's a temporary tactical retreat. Lyra walked over to Ren, the small Leonian boy who was currently trying to chew on the leg of an exam table. She knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with him. Hi, she said softly. I'm Lyra. My dad looks like he's made of old leather and bad decisions, but he's harmless. Do you like nutrient crackers? Ren stopped chewing and looked at her. Are they the orange ones? The orangest, Lyra promised, reaching into her pocket. She stood up and turned to Elias, her expression turning fierce. Dad, I saw the bounty postings. Vane has put their faces on every holoscreen from the docks to the spire. He's calling them a biological containment hazard. He says they're carrying a plague. Standard psychological warfare, Elias said, rubbing his face with his hands. Dehumanize the target. Make it easier for civilians to report them and for security to shoot them. If you kick them out, Dad, Lyra said, her voice steady and hard, I will never forgive you. I mean it. I'll change the door codes. I'll sleep in the vents. I won't let you send them back out there. Elias looked at his daughter. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire Sarah used to have when she argued about refugee rights or wounded strays. He felt a mixture of annoyance and a strange, aching relief. He didn't have to be the bad guy. He didn't have to make the hard choice, because Lyra had already made it for him. Nobody's getting kicked out, Lyra, Elias grunted. Not tonight. Now go help Vanya figure out the food synthesizer and find some blankets. This place isn't exactly a five-star hotel. Go. Lyra beamed and led the children toward the back living quarters. Elias turned to Kaylin. She was standing by the darkened window, her hand still on her pulse blade. We need to open the rest of that file, Elias said, pulling the obsidian crystal from his pocket. The first layer was just a match. There's something else inside. Something Vane is terrified of. He walked over to his main diagnostic console and placed the crystal onto the interface. The blue light flared, recognizing his bioprint. Identity confirmed. Decrypting layer 2. Rows of code cascaded down the holographic display. It was dense, complex, and aggressive. Elias frowned, his eyes darting across the hex codes. I know this syntax, he whispered. He leaned in, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. This isn't standard encryption. This is Midnight Echo. It's a ghost protocol we used in the border wars. It uses a shifting cipher based on star charts. Star charts? Kaylin asked, leaning over his shoulder. Specific dates and specific coordinates, Elias said. He typed a command into the interface. Query, key origin. The file responded with a string of numbers. Sector 4, Moon 9, Day 2, 114. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. The room seemed to tilt. Elias, Kaylin's voice sounded far away. What is it? That date, Elias said, his voice hollow. That location, Sector 4, Moon 9. That was the raid. What raid? The mission where my unit was ambushed, Elias whispered. We were acting on intel from High Proctor Vane. He was a colonel back then. He told us the moon was an insurgent base. We dropped into a kill zone. Half my squad was wiped out in 10 minutes. He looked up at Kaylin, his eyes haunted. That was the day Sarah's shuttle was shot down. She was the extraction pilot. She came in to get us out, and they blew her out of the sky. I thought it was bad luck. I thought it was the fog of war. He looked back at the screen. The file was pulsing now, a steady, demanding crimson. She didn't die because of a mistake, Elias realized, the rage beginning to boil in his veins. She died because she found out what Vane was doing. This file, it's not just a match for me. It's the black box data from her shuttle. It's the proof that Vane murdered an entire unit to cover his tracks. A heavy boom echoed through the clinic. The blast shutters rattled. They're here, Kaylin said, drawing her blade. Elias didn't flinch. He looked at the data crystal, then at the door where he could hear Lyra laughing with the children. Let them come, Elias said, picking up a heavy surgical laser and adjusting the setting to lethal. I'm done fixing things. It's time to start breaking them. The heavy Durasteel shutters of the clinic didn't just rattle. They groaned under the rhythmic impact of a kinetic ram. Each strike sounded like a thunderclap inside the cramped, sterile confines of the veterinary bay. Elias Thorne stood in the center of the room, his boots planted firmly on the metal grating. He wasn't the broken man who had spent the last 5 years nursing injured lizards and avoiding his own reflection. He was a combat medic again, his eyes tracking the structural weak points of the door with a cold, analytical precision. They're using a Mark 7 breaching charge, Elias said, his voice dropping into a low, professional register. We have exactly 45 seconds before the magnetic locks fuse and the door becomes a pile of slag. Lyra, get the kids into the subfloor ventilation. Dad, I can't, Lyra shouted from the back office, her fingers dancing across a holographic interface that flickered with crimson warning signs. Vane's tech squad is running a ghost logic override on the station's grid. They've locked the floor plates. I'm pinned here trying to keep the atmospheric scrubbers from venting our oxygen into the void. Elias swore under his breath. Kalen, Vanya, perimeter defense. Use the exam tables as hardcover. Lyra, forget the scrubbers. Focus on the internal security turrets. Give them some static to chew on. Kalen moved with a fluid, predatory grace, her midnight black fur bristling as she hauled a heavy titanium surgical table onto its side. She didn't use a pulse rifle. Instead, she drew a pair of serrated vibroblades that hummed with a deadly, low-frequency violet light. We don't have enough cover, Thorne. If they come in with thermal limiters, we're toasted. We need a distraction. I'm the distraction, Elias said. He reached into a cabinet and pulled out a large pressurized canister of aerosolized anesthetic. It was designed to knock out a 600-kilogram forest behemoth in less than 3 seconds. He strapped a portable filtration mask over his face and tossed another to Vanya. When that door goes, I'm venting the tank. It won't stop their armor, but it'll cloud their visors and scramble their biological sensors. Leonians, stay low. Their HUDs will be looking for standing targets. Vanya caught the mask, her golden eyes wide. And the children? They're behind the lead-lined medicine cabinet, Elias said, gesturing to the heavy reinforced locker where he kept the high-grade narcotics. It's the most secure spot in the room. Nova, listen to me. Keep Pip quiet. No matter what sounds you hear, you do not open that door until I say the word Phoenix. You got me? Nova, the 8-year-old girl with eyes too old for her face, nodded slowly. She pulled the toddler, Pip, closer to her chest. We stay quiet. We wait for Phoenix. I've got him, Dr. Elias. The third strike on the door was the final one. The metal didn't just bend. It disintegrated into a shower of white-hot sparks as the thermite breach took hold. The airlock hissed, and 4 erasers stepped through the smoke. They were hulking figures in matte gray composite armor, their visors glowing with a cold, robotic blue light. They carried short-barrel plasma shredders, weapons designed for close-quarters liquidation. Target acquired, one of the armored soldiers stated, his voice distorted by a mechanical synthesizer. Neutralize the human vet. Secure the specimens. Eat this, scrap heaps! Elias roared. He smashed the valve on the anesthetic canister and kicked it toward the doorway. A thick, milky white cloud erupted into the room, swirling in the artificial gravity. The erasers instantly raised their weapons. But the gas was more than just a sedative. Elias had mixed it with a heavy concentration of metallic dust he used for patching animal shells. The cloud became a thick, opaque wall that reflected their scanning lasers back into their own eyes. Error, the lead eraser droned. Optical sensors overloaded, shifting to thermal. Now, Elias yelled. Kalen was a blur of black shadow in the mist. She didn't charge the soldiers. She moved along the ceiling, using the exposed pipes of the ossuary's ribcage as handholds. She dropped behind the second soldier like a falling star, her vibro blades slicing through the soft joints of his knee armor. The man went down with a grunt of mechanical pain. Vanya followed, her pulse blade carving a glowing arc through the white fog. She took the soldier on the right, her movements a rhythmic dance of strikes and parries. But the erasers were professional killers. The remaining 2 soldiers didn't panic. They stood back to back and began blind firing their plasma shredders in wide, sweeping arcs. Bolts of superheated gas tore through the clinic, melting the glass jars of medicine and scorching the ivory white bone of the walls. One bolt clipped an exam light, sending a shower of sparks onto the floor. Lyra, the turrets! Elias shouted, diving behind a crate of synthetic bandages as a plasma bolt hissed inches above his head. Got 'em! Lyra screamed. From the ceiling, 2 small, concealed defense turrets, normally used to discourage the station's vermin, whirred to life. They didn't fire lethal rounds. They fired high-velocity kinetic slugs. The impact wasn't enough to pierce the eraser armor, but it was enough to knock them off balance. Elias saw his opening. He didn't have a gun, but he had a high-powered surgical laser used for cauterizing deep wounds in massive exobeasts. He grabbed the handle, aimed for the glowing blue visor of the lead soldier, and squeezed the trigger. The beam was thin, focused, and incredibly hot. It punched through the reinforced glass of the visor like a needle through paper. The eraser let out a short, wet scream before falling backward, his armor clattering against the floor. "One down," Elias panted. But the victory was short-lived. A secondary explosion rocked the clinic. A grenade launched from the corridor outside. The blast blew the medicine cabinet off its hinges and sent a wave of concussive force through the room. "The kids!" Vanya cried out, her ears flattened in terror. Elias scrambled toward the wreckage of the medicine cabinet. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, irregular beat. For a second he wasn't in the ossuary. He was back in the canyons of Sector 4, looking at the flaming wreckage of a shuttle. "Nova! Pip!" he screamed. The heavy lead door of the cabinet pushed outward. Nova crawled out, her face covered in white dust, but her eyes were clear. She was dragging Pip by his collar. The toddler was crying, a loud, healthy wail that was the most beautiful sound Elias had ever heard. "We're okay," Nova gasped. "The box held. But they're coming through the walls, Elias." She was right. The erasers weren't just using the door. They were cutting through the petrified bone of the station. 3 more thermal breaches began to glow on the north wall. They were being surrounded. "We're scrapped if we stay here," Kaylin said, sliding back to Elias's side, her fur matted with blood that wasn't hers. "Thorne, we need an exit that isn't on the map." Elias looked at the floor. Specifically, he looked at the drain for the clinic's waste wash. It was a 20-centimeter wide pipe that led directly into the primary marrow vein of the station, the massive, hollowed-out center of the cosmic Leviathan's spine. "Lyra, can you open the primary waste gate?" Elias asked, his voice urgent. "That leads to the uncharted zones, Dad." Lyra shouted, emerging from the office with her datapad clutched to her chest. "No one goes down there. The pressure is unstable, and the ghost logic is corrupted." "It's better than getting zeroed here," Elias said. He grabbed a heavy wrench and smashed the grate off the floor. "Kaylin, you go first. Catch the kids. Vanya, you're the rear guard. I'll follow Lyra." "This is a bad play, human," Kaylin muttered. But she didn't hesitate. She shifted into a tighter, more feline form and slid into the dark opening of the pipe. One by one, they dropped. Elias handed the children to Vanya, who lowered them into the dark. Pip went first, then Ren, then the 3 Leonian kits. Nova went last, looking at Elias with a strange, solemn trust before vanishing into the hole. "Your turn, Lyra," Elias said. "I'm not leaving my servers, Dad," she argued, her eyes welling with tears. 5 years of work is in those drives." Elias grabbed her by the shoulders. "The work isn't the mission, Lyra. You are, now move!" He practically shoved her into the pipe. He heard her slide down, her yelp of surprise echoing in the metal tube. Elias stood alone in the ruins of his clinic. The walls were melting. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and burning bone. He looked at the jars of medicine, the 3-legged lizard in its cage, which he quickly unlatched, letting the creature scurry into the vents, and finally at the data crystal in his pocket. The erasers burst through the north wall, their weapons leveled. "Surrender the specimens," the leader commanded. "Specimens?" Elias spat the word like it was poison. "They're not specimens. They're my family." He pulled a small, improvised explosive from his belt, a combination of highly unstable cleaning fluid and a thermal battery. He tossed it at the primary oxygen tank and dived into the waste pipe. The explosion behind him was a roar of white light and heat that chased him down the narrow tube. He slid for what felt like miles, the cold, smooth metal of the pipe burning against his skin. He felt the gravity shift as he moved deeper into the station's core, the weight of the massive bone structure pressing down on him. He emerged from the pipe and tumbled into a pile of soft, bioluminescent moss. He gasped for air, his lungs burning. He was in the marrow. It was a vast, cathedral-like space, miles wide and hundreds of miles long. Above them, the giant, petrified vertebrae of the Leviathan arched like the ribs of a forgotten god. The air here was different, thick with the scent of ancient dust and a strange electric charge that made his hair stand on end. The only light came from the glowing fungus that grew in the cracks of the bone and the faint blue flicker of ghost logic terminals that had been abandoned for centuries. "Is everyone KIA?" Elias wheezed, pushing himself up. "We're all here, Dad," Lyra said. She was sitting on a calcified ridge, her datapad already out. She looked shaken, but she was already scanning the area. But we're 5 kilometers below the civilized sectors. We're in the dead zone. Kaylin stood a few meters away, her blade still out, scanning the darkness. The children were huddled together, staring up at the massive glowing arches above them. We're safe for now, Kaylin said, her golden eyes reflecting the blue moss. But Vane won't stop. He'll send the trackers. And down here, there's nowhere to run. Elias looked at the group. They were a mess, bloody, terrified, and lost in the bowels of a dead monster. But as he saw Vanya checking Nova for injuries and Ren sharing his last nutrient cracker with Tali, he felt that strange, unfamiliar warmth in his chest again. He had gone to a bar looking for a date. He had ended up in the marrow with 2 alien warriors and 5 orphans. We don't need to run, Elias said, his voice echoing in the vast space. We're in the heart of the station now, and Sarah left us a map. It's time to see what she really wanted us to find. He pulled the data crystal from his pocket. In the deep darkness of the marrow, its blue pulse was the brightest thing in the world. The marrow was not silent. It was a place of 1,000 whispers, the groan of settling bone, the hiss of ancient gas vents, and the distant, rhythmic throb of the station's primary core, which sounded like a heartbeat miles away. Elias led the group along a narrow ledge of calcified calcium, his lantern cutting a lonely path through the gloom. How far to the next hub, Lyra? Elias asked. He was carrying Pip on his back, the toddler having finally succumbed to exhaustion. The weight was a constant reminder of the stakes. 3 kilometers, Lyra replied, her voice echoing strangely. But the map is glitching. The ghost logic down here is fragmented. It's like the station is trying to remember itself and failing. Dad, the sensors are picking up movement in the lower troughs. Scrappers. Or maybe something worse. Stay in the light, Elias commanded the children. Vanya, watch the rear. If anything moves, don't wait for an ID. Just neutralize. Understood, Vanya said. She looked tired, her tawny fur matted with the gray dust of the marrow. Elias, the kits are reaching their limit. They need water, and the atmosphere down here is thin. Their lung sacs aren't as efficient as humans. Elias stopped. He looked at the 3 Leonian kits. They were lagging behind, their ears drooping and their tails tucked tight between their legs. He felt a pang of guilt. He was pushing them like soldiers, forgetting they were barely more than toddlers. We rest here, Elias said, pointing to a small alcove carved into a massive spinal process. It was a sheltered spot, hidden from the main path by a curtain of glowing vines. Kaylin, help me set up the thermal screen. We need to hide our heat signatures before the trackers catch our scent. As they settled into the alcove, Elias pulled a small portable water purifier from his bag. He filled a collapsible cup and handed it to Ren, the oldest Leonian kit. Drink slow, kid, Elias said, his voice softening. It's recycled, but it's clean. Ren took the cup with trembling hands. Are the bad men going to find us here, Dr. Elias? Elias knelt down, looking the boy in the eye. Not if I have anything to say about it. And believe me, I'm a very loud man when I want to be. Ren let out a tiny, weak laugh. It was a start. While the children ate their meager rations, Elias sat with Kaylin and Vanya near the edge of the alcove. He pulled the data crystal, the legacy protocol, from his pocket and set it on a flat stone. It's time, Elias said. We're deep enough that the signal shouldn't leak to the upper levels. Lyra, can you give me a hard link? Lyra crawled over, her eyes bright with curiosity. She pulled a fiber optic cable from her kit and snapped it into the side of the crystal. Be careful, Dad. Layer 2 is wrapped in a psychoreactive firewall. It's designed to respond to your emotional state as much as your DNA. If you're too agitated, it might lock us out for another 24 hours. I'm as calm as a dead moon, Elias lied. He placed his hand on the crystal. The blue light flared, turning a deep sapphire violet. The air in the alcove suddenly grew cold, and a holographic projection shimmered into existence. It wasn't a map or a file this time. It was a person, Sarah. She looked exactly as Elias remembered her hair a mess of blonde curls, a smudge of engine grease on her cheek, and that defiant, mischievous spark in her eyes. But she was wearing a flight suit he didn't recognize, one emblazoned with a sigil he hadn't seen before, a stylized heart entwined with a DNA helix. Elias, the hologram said, Her voice was a ghost, a synthesized echo of a woman who had been gone for 5 years. If you're seeing this, it means the search algorithm found you. It means you're alive, and well, I'm probably not. Elias reached out, his fingers passing through the light of her image. Sarah, he whispered, his voice cracking. I don't have much time, the hologram continued, her image flickering with static. Vane is moving. He's no longer content with just corporate power. He's obsessed with the Ethelgard project. Elias, those children, they aren't just orphans. They are the result of a multi-generational experiment in genetic resilience. The Leonian kits carry a dormant viral strain in their marrow that can repair neural damage in humans. It's the key to immortality, or at least, that's what Vane thinks. Kalen stiffened beside Elias. Ethelgard, that was our home. He didn't just optimize us, he harvested us. The human children, Nova and Pip, Sarah's image said, her face filled with a profound sadness. They are the catalysts. Their DNA has been modified to act as a bridge. If Vane gets them back, he'll use them to create a serum that will give him and his board members centuries of life, while leaving the rest of the sector to rot in the slums. He'll turn the Leonian race into a literal blood bank. Sarah leaned closer to the camera, her expression turning urgent. Elias, I couldn't save them all. I only got these 5 out. I hid the master encryption key in their biological markers. Together, they are the only record of Vane's crimes. If they die, the truth dies with them. You have to take them to the Starfall archive. It's the only place neutral enough to broadcast the data across the entire convergence grid. The hologram began to fade, the light flickering as the power in the crystal wavered. I chose you, Elias, not because you're a hero, Sarah said, her voice softening into something intensely personal. I chose you because you know what it's like to lose everything and still keep walking. I chose you because I knew you'd look at those kids and see a family, not a file. I love you, Elias. Always. Be the match they need. The image vanished, leaving the alcove in sudden, crushing darkness. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was the distant dripping of water and the soft breathing of the sleeping children. Elias sat with his head in his hands. The weight of the world, the weight of 5 years of grief and 20 years of war, felt like it was finally going to break him. He wasn't a savior. He was just a man who wanted to fix broken things in peace. She really believed in you, Vanya said, her voice gentle. She placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. She knew you were more than a vet, Elias Thorne. She was wrong, Elias said, his voice muffled. I couldn't even save her. How am I supposed to save them? We're 5 kilometers underground, hunted by the most powerful man in the sector, with a toddler who needs a nap every 2 hours. Kalen stood up, her golden eyes glowing with a fierce, cold light. She wasn't wrong. Look at them, Thorne. Elias looked. In the dim light of the moss, he saw Nova sitting by the sleeping Leonian kits. She had taken off her own ragged jacket and tucked it around Ren and Tally to keep them warm. She was watching Elias, her eyes steady and unafraid. We're not a burden, Nova said. Her voice was small but firm. We know what we are. We know Vane wants to turn us into medicine. But we're people, and we chose to follow you. You didn't have a choice, Nova, Elias said. You were following a file. No, Nova countered. We were following the man who kicked the coffee machine because it wasn't working right. We were following the man who treated a 3-legged lizard like it was a king. We chose you because you care about things that are broken. Elias looked at the girl. He saw Sarah in her, not in her face, but in her spirit. That same stubborn, beautiful refusal to accept the cruelty of the universe. He realized then that Sarah hadn't just left him a mission. She had left him a mirror. She was showing him that the only way to heal his own heart was to protect theirs. Family's a choice, isn't it? Elias whispered to the dark. He stood up, his joints popping, his shoulders screaming in protest. He reached out and picked up his medical bag. All right, Elias said, his voice regaining its command. Lyra, get the coordinates for the Starfall archive. We're going to need a way to move 5 kids across 3 sectors without triggering every sensor on the station. I'm already on it, Dad, Lyra said, a grin finally breaking through her exhaustion. The Marrow has an old gravity transit system used by the miners a century ago. It's dangerous, it's noisy, and it'll probably make us all throw up. But it's fast. Fast is good, Kaylin said, checking the charge on her blades. But we have a problem. The trackers are closer than I thought. I can smell their pheromone masks. They're in the trough below us. Elias looked down into the darkness of the trough. He saw a flicker of red light, the thermal optics of a scouting drone. They're ghosting us, Elias said. They're not attacking because they're waiting for the main squad. They want to pin us here. Then we don't stay pinned, Elias said. He turned to the children. Wake up, kids. It's time for a field trip. We're taking the scenic route. He scooped up Pip, who let out a sleepy groan. He looked at Kaylin and Vanya. I'll draw them into the vent shafts. You take the kids to the transit station. Lyra, you're the pilot. If I'm not there in 10 minutes, you launch anyway. No, Lyra shouted, grabbing his arm. I'm not losing you again, Dad. Not like Mom. You're not losing me, Elias said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. I'm a medic, remember? I'm the guy who stitches things back together. I'll be right behind you, but I need you to lead them. Can you do that for me? Lyra looked at the children, then back at Elias. She wiped her eyes and nodded. 10 minutes, Elias. If you're 1 second late, I'm coming back for you with a plasma shredder. That's my girl, Elias said. He turned toward the dark trough, his surgical laser at the ready. He wasn't running anymore. He was the shield. He was the father. And as he stepped into the shadows of the marrow, he felt the ghost of Sarah's hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the light. The erasers were coming. Vane was waiting, but Elias Thorne had 5 reasons to stay alive, and for the first time in 5 years, that was enough. Come and get me, you meat sacks, Elias whispered to the dark. The hunt was on, but the predator had just found a new pack. Elias Thorne did not like being a ghost. For 5 years, he had lived as a shadow on the periphery of the ossuary, a man who spoke to animals because they didn't ask about his past and didn't look at him with the pity that followed a widower. But as he crawled through the narrow, calcified arteries of the ventilation system, he realized that he had never truly been a ghost. He had just been a man in a very long, very quiet waiting room. The air in the vents was thick with the scent of 100,000 cycles of recycled breath and the faint coppery tang of mineral oxidation. Every few meters, he had to squeeze past a jagged protrusion of petrified bone that looked like a serrated tooth. The station was literally a carcass, and Elias was moving through its throat. Status check, Elias whispered into his comm bead, his voice barely a vibration. We're at the transit junction, Dad. Lyra's voice came back, tight with adrenaline. Ren's struggling. The pressure differential is giving him a migraine, and the Leonian kits are starting to hiss at the shadows. We're sitting ducks out here in the open. Keep them moving, Lyra, Elias said. He stopped at a junction where 4 pipes intersected like a cluster of veins. I've got 3 trackers on my 6. I'm going to lead them into the eye socket fan array. Once I trigger the override, they'll be fighting 50-mile-per-hour crosswinds. That should give you the window you need. Dad, those fans are ancient, Lyra argued. If you blow the magnetic stabilizers, the whole sector could lose atmospheric tension. You'll be in the middle of a vacuum breach. I'm a medic, kid. I know how to hold my breath, Elias grunted. Just get to that mining car. Phoenix out. He cut the connection before she could argue. He didn't want to hear her fear. It was too similar to the sound Sarah had made over the comms 5 years ago, right before the signal went to static. He couldn't let history repeat itself. He would be the sacrifice this time. He would be the one who stayed behind to make sure the light stayed on for everyone else. Elias pulled a small vial of pheromone masking gel from his medical kit. He smeared it over his neck and wrists, the pungent chemical smell making his eyes water. To the eraser drones, he would now smell like a patch of damp moss or a rusted pipe. It was a dirty trick, one he had learned during the siege of Sector 9, but it was effective against thermal sensors. He heard them then, the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of multi-legged drones. They weren't using the main pipes. They were scuttling along the exterior, their magnetic grippers vibrating through the bone. Come and get me, you bucketheads, Elias muttered. He didn't run. He moved with a deliberate, slow grace, leading them deeper into the labyrinth. He passed a massive bypass valve that looked like a valve in a giant heart. He remembered Sarah telling him once that the ossuary wasn't just a station, it was a library of biological history. Every bone told a story of a creature that had once swam through the stars. He reached the eye socket fan array 3 minutes later. It was a cavernous space dominated by three massive, rusted blades that provided the primary circulation for the lower marrow. The blades were 20 meters long, held in place by flickering magnetic coils that groaned under the strain of centuries of neglect. Elias crawled onto the maintenance gantry that overlooked the abyss. Below him, the darkness of the eye socket stretched down into the void of the nebula. The first drone emerged from the vent behind him. It was a scout model, a sleek black orb with 6 spindly legs and a glowing red sensor eye. It paused, its head tilting as it tried to reconcile the pheromone scent with the human heat signature it had been tracking. "Lost your way, scrap heap?" Elias said, standing up. He raised his surgical laser. He wasn't aiming for the drone. He was aiming for the magnetic stabilizer on the primary fan. "Identity confirmed," the drone's speaker crackled. "Elias Thorne. Target neutralized." The drone lunged, its legs unfolding into serrated blades. At the same moment, 2 more drones burst from the ceiling, their red eyes locking onto Elias. Elias squeezed the trigger. The laser beam hit the stabilizer coil with a brilliant, white-hot flash. The magnetic field didn't just fail, it collapsed with a thunderous roar. The massive fan blade, no longer held in its orbit, began to wobble. The friction of the rusted axle created a shower of sparks that illuminated the eye socket like a dying sun. A wall of air, compressed by the sudden shift in gravity, slammed into the gantry. Elias was thrown backward, his breath stolen by the sheer force of the wind. The drones were caught in the vortex, their magnetic grippers unable to hold on to the vibrating bone. They were sucked into the spinning blades, disintegrating into a cloud of shrapnel and sparks. Elias grabbed the railing, his fingers screaming as the metal heated up. The gantry was buckling. Through the roar of the wind, he heard the station's sirens beginning to wail, the sound of a lung being punctured. "Lyra!" Elias shouted into his comms, though he knew the interference would be catastrophic. "Go! Now!" He lay there on the vibrating metal, the cold air of the void beginning to whistle through the cracks in the bone. He felt a strange, detached peace. He had done his job. He had protected the pack. He looked at the data crystal in his hand, its blue light flickering as if it were shivering. He had spent 5 years trying to save Sarah in his dreams. He had replayed that mission 1,000 times, thinking if he had only been faster, if he had only been smarter, she would be here. But as the gantry began to tilt toward the abyss, he realized that he hadn't been waiting for her to come back. He had been waiting for a reason to stop running. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Elias whispered. "I tried." Suddenly, the wind changed. The roar of the collapsing fan was replaced by a sharp, high-pitched whistle. "You are not doing this again, Dad!" A shadow dropped from the ceiling. It wasn't an eraser. It was Kaylin. She landed on the tilting gantry with the weight of a mountain, her claws sinking deep into the metal. She didn't look at the drones or the abyss. She looked at Elias with a fury that burned brighter than any laser. "What are you doing here?" Elias gasped, the thin air making his head spin. "I told you to go." "And I told you that we are a pack," Kaylin snarled. She grabbed him by the back of his tactical vest and hauled him up with one arm. "In my culture, the elders don't get to commit suicide just because they're feeling poetic. You have 5 kids and a daughter who will haunt my dreams if I let you fall. You are coming with me. The car, the transit, Vanya has it," Kaylin said. She looked at the collapsing fan, then at the vent they had just crawled out of. "We have exactly 10 seconds before the atmospheric seal triggers and locks this whole sector. Hold on." Kaylin didn't run. She leaped. She cleared the 10-meter gap between the gantry and the vent with a strength that defied the failing gravity. They slammed into the bone wall, Elias's ribs groaning under the impact. But Kaylin didn't let go. She scrambled into the pipe just as the massive Durasteel blast shutters slammed shut behind them, sealing off the eye socket. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. Elias lay in the dark, his heart thumping like a drum. He looked at Kaylin, who was sitting against the wall, her fur standing on end, her golden eyes narrowed in the gloom. "You're a pain in the neck, Thorne," Kaylin panted. "Do you have any idea how much effort it takes to track a man who smells like a damp basement?" Elias let out a short, shaky laugh. He wiped the pheromone gel from his face, feeling the warmth of the blood on his shoulder. "I thought I was being a hero. You were being a martyr." Kaylin corrected. She leaned forward, her face inches from his. A hero is someone who stays alive to see the job through. A martyr is just someone who's tired of fighting. Which one are you? Elias looked at his hands. They were shaking. He looked at the data crystal still clutched in his palm. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like a man who had just been given a second chance he didn't deserve. I'm a medic, Elias said, his voice steadying, and I think I have some patients waiting for me. Kaylin grunted and stood up, offering him a hand. Good. Because the transit car is 3 sectors away, and Vanya is currently trying to explain to a toddler why he can't eat the steering column. Let's move, human. We're losing the light. As they moved back through the marrow, Elias felt the shift in his own internal gravity. He had spent so long thinking that family was something you lost, a fragile thing that broke under the weight of the universe. But as Kaylin guided him through the dark, her hand on his shoulder, he realized that family wasn't a static thing you guarded. It was a choice you made every time the wind started to blow. He wasn't Sarah's ghost anymore. He was the pack's anchor, and they were going to need every bit of his stubborn, human stupidity to get through the next few sectors. The transit station at the base of the spine was a graveyard of industrial ambition. Hundreds of years ago, when the ossuary was first being hollowed out for its mineral marrow, the miners had built a network of high-speed gravity trains to move ore to the upper docks. Now the station was a cavernous hall of rusted iron and flickering ghost logic terminals. The tracks, 2 massive rails of superconducting copper, stretched out into the darkness like the veins of a long-dead god. Over here! Lyra's voice echoed through the hall. Elias and Kaylin emerged from the maintenance tunnel to see a small, battered mining car sitting on the rails. It looked like a metal box that had been chewed on by a giant and then spat out. Vanya was standing on the roof, her pulse blade drawn, while the children were huddled inside the cabin. Dad! Lyra ran to Elias, throwing her arms around his waist. She didn't say anything, but the way she held on, her small frame shaking, told him everything he needed to know. I'm here, Lyra, Elias whispered, patting her hair. I'm here. Is the car ready? It's a junker, Elias, Vanya shouted from the roof. The magnetic levitators are only operating at 40% capacity. If we hit a curve too fast, we'll spin off the rails into the pressure basins. Then we don't hit the curves fast, Elias said, gently disengaging from Lyra. He looked at the mining car. It was small, barely enough room for 8 people and a data crystal. Milo, Ren, Tali, get in the center. Nova, you're in charge of the emergency brake. If I tell you to pull it, you pull it with everything you've got. Nova nodded, her face pale but determined. She sat next to the manual lever, her hand already gripping the rusted handle. Elias climbed into the driver's seat. The controls were ancient, a series of levers and physical buttons that predated the neural links of the core worlds. He looked at the primary power cell. It was glowing a sickly, flickering green. We have enough juice for one shot, Elias said. Once we start the descent, there's no turning back. Lyra, can you link your data pad to the guidance system? I need you to predict the track failures before we hit them. On it, Dad, Lyra said, sliding into the seat beside him. Her fingers blurred across her screen. I'm ghosting the station's transit net. Vane's men are trying to lock the switches, but I'm feeding them a feedback loop. They think we're heading for the smelting vats on level 7. Good, Elias said. He looked at Kaylin and Vanya. Get inside. We're leaving. Kaylin dropped from the roof and slid into the cabin, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. This is a terrible plan, Thorne. I want that on the record. Noted, Elias said. He grabbed the primary throttle. Hold on to your kits. 3, 2, 1, launch. He slammed the throttle forward. The mining car groaned, a sound of complaining metal that vibrated through the floor. For a second, nothing happened. Then the magnetic coils beneath the car hummed to life with a high-pitched whine. The car lurched forward, slowly at first, then with a sudden, gut-wrenching acceleration. They weren't just moving, they were falling. The gravity train relied on the natural incline of the station's spine to gain speed. Within seconds, the station was a blur behind them. The wind roared through the open-sided cabin, carrying the scent of ancient dust and ozone. We're hitting 80 kilometers per hour, Lyra shouted, her hair whipping around her face. Dad, the next junction is a 3-way split. The left track is collapsed. We have to take the center. Elias grabbed the switching lever. It was frozen. He pulled with both hands, his muscles screaming, but the rusted mechanism wouldn't budge. It's stuck, Elias yelled. Kaylin lunged forward, her powerful hands joining his on the lever. Together, human, on three. 1, 2, 3. With a loud metallic crack, the lever snapped into place. The car lurched to the right, sparks flying as the magnetic guide fins scraped against the center rail. They cleared the junction with inches to spare, the collapsed track vanishing into the darkness behind them. Inside the cabin, the children were huddled together, Ren and Pip bearing their faces in Vanya's cloak. But Nova was still standing by the brake, her eyes fixed on Elias. She wasn't crying. She was watching him, her expression one of absolute terrifying trust. "Dad, we have a problem," Lyra screamed. "The trackers, they didn't fall for the loop." Elias looked back. 2 sleek, black pursuit skiffs were screaming down the rails behind them. They were much faster than the mining car, their powerful engines glowing with a fierce blue light. These weren't drones. They were piloted by Vane's elite eraser squad. "They're gaining on us," Vanya shouted, drawing her pulse pistol. "They'll be in firing range in 30 seconds. "Can we go faster?" Kaylin asked, her claws digging into the seat frame. "If we go any faster, we'll melt the coils," Elias said. He looked at the track ahead. They were approaching the Marrow Loop, a massive spiral that led into the heart of the station's power core. The tracks there were ancient, and the gravity was unstable. "Lyra, the loop!" Elias yelled. "What's the structural integrity?" 60% and dropping, Lyra replied, her voice shaking. "Dad, if we hit the loop at this speed, the centrifugal force will tear the car apart." "We don't have a choice," Elias said. He looked back at the pursuit skiffs. They were opening fire. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, hitting the back of the mining car. The metal glowed red, and the cabin filled with the smell of burning insulation. "Ren's hurt," Vanya cried out. Elias glanced back. A fragment of shrapnel had sliced across the Leonian Kit's arm. The boy was staring at the wound, his golden eyes wide with shock, but he wasn't making a sound. The medic and Elias took over. "Vanya, use the pressure bandage in the side pocket. Nova, help her. Lyra, keep your eyes on the track." He turned back to the throttle. His mind was racing. He was a vet. He was a medic. He was a father. He had spent his life trying to save people one by one, but now he had to save them all at once. "Kaylin, I need you to do something crazy," Elias said, his voice strangely calm. "I'm a Leonian in a falling metal box, Thorne. Crazy is my current operating state," Kaylin replied. "See that maintenance crane up ahead?" Elias pointed to a massive rusted arm that hung over the tracks. "It's still connected to the emergency power grid. If you can hit the release valve as we pass, it'll drop the counterweights onto the track. It'll block the erasers." "And what about us?" "We'll be past it," Elias said, "but you'll have to time it to the millisecond. If you're too early, we're the ones who get crushed." Kaylin looked at the crane, then at Elias. She didn't ask for a plan. She didn't ask for the odds. She just nodded and climbed out onto the exterior ledge of the car, her fur whipping in the gale. "Lyra, give me everything," Elias roared. He jammed the throttle past the safety limiters. The mining car screamed, the magnetic coils glowing a fierce, terrifying white. The speed gauge climbed, 100, 120, 150 kilometers per hour. The car began to shake violently. Screws popped from the walls and the floor plates rattled so hard Elias could feel his teeth vibrating. The crane was coming up fast. "Kaylin, now!" Elias yelled. Kaylin didn't fire a weapon. She leaped from the moving car, her body a blur of black shadow. She caught the crane's maintenance ladder, her momentum nearly tearing her arms from her sockets, but she held on. She scrambled up the arm and slammed her fist into the manual release valve. The massive 10-ton counterweights dropped with a sound that shook the very foundations of the ossuary. They plummeted toward the track just as the mining car roared beneath them. Elias felt the wind of the falling weights on the back of his neck. A split second later, there was a thunderous explosion. The 2 pursuit skiffs, moving too fast to brake, slammed into the counterweights. The explosion was a brilliant fireball of blue plasma and twisted metal that illuminated the entire Marrow. The shockwave hit the mining car, sending it skidding sideways on the rails. "Nova, the brake!" Elias screamed. Nova didn't hesitate. She threw her entire weight onto the lever. The manual brakes, physical pads of reinforced ceramic, slammed against the rails. The screeching sound was deafening, a high-pitched wail of friction that filled the cabin with black smoke. The car spun, sparks flying in a 30-meter arc, before finally coming to a shuddering, violent halt. Silence returned to the Marrow, thick and heavy. Elias sat in the driver's seat, his hands frozen on the throttle. He was covered in sweat, his heart beating so hard he thought it might burst. He looked at Lyra. She was pale, her eyes wide, but she was breathing. Did we do it?" she whispered. Elias looked back. The pursuit skiffs were gone, replaced by a smoking pile of rubble on the tracks. Kaylin was climbing down from the crane, her midnight fur dusted with gray soot, looking like a vengeful spirit. Vanya was huddled in the back with the children. Ren was bandaged, Nova was holding Pip, and the three kits were finally mercifully asleep. But it was the silence that hit Elias the hardest. In the quiet, he realized what had just happened. He had risked everything, not just his own life, but the lives of his daughter and the children. To win, he looked at Nova. She was still holding the brake lever, her small hands white with the strain. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a tear track through the dust on her cheek. "You saved us," she whispered. Elias didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had just looked into the abyss and realized that the abyss was crowded. He had spent years thinking he was alone in his grief, but these children were carrying a darkness just as heavy as his, and they were looking to him to show them how to carry it. He stood up, his legs shaking. He walked to the back of the car and knelt down in front of Ren. He checked the boy's bandage, his hands moving with the practiced grace of a medic. "You did good, kid," Elias said, his voice rough. "You're the toughest Leonian I've ever met." Ren looked at him, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "I didn't cry, Dr. Elias. Just like you said." "I know," Elias said. "I know." He looked at Vanya and Kaylin. They were both watching him, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and respect. They had seen him act as a soldier, but more importantly, they had seen him act as a father. "We're not out of it yet," Kaylin said, her voice low. "We're in the heart of the power core. The Starfall archive is just above us, but we'll have to climb the primary elevator shaft, and Vane will be waiting." "I know," Elias said. He looked at the data crystal, still glowing in his pocket. It felt heavier now, as if the weight of Sarah's message was finally sinking in. He had learned the first lesson. Family was a choice. But as he looked at the children, he realized there was a second, harder lesson coming. Family wasn't just about protection, it was about sacrifice. And he knew that before this was over, the universe would ask for more than just his stubbornness. "Lyra, check the elevator codes," Elias said. "Kaylin, Vanya, resupply from the car's emergency kit. We're going to the top." He looked at the dark arches of the Marrow one last time. He had been a ghost here, but now he was something else. He was a man with a pack, and God help anyone who tried to take them away from him. "Let's go," Elias said. "We have a message to deliver." As they began the long climb, Elias realized that the perfect match Sarah had intended wasn't just about him and the children. It was about a broken man in a broken world, and the desperate, beautiful hope that they could fix each other. The theme was no longer a seed. It was beginning to bloom, but the soil was made of blood and bone, and Elias knew the harvest would be the hardest thing he had ever faced. The vertical shaft leading from the Marrow to the Starfall archive was a 300-meter climb through the forgotten architecture of the ossuary. The walls here were a fusion of calcified ancient tissue and rusted structural supports, a skeletal ladder reaching toward the light of the upper sectors. Elias Thorne felt every one of his 42 years with each handhold. His shoulder, grazed by an eraser's bullet only hours ago, throbbed with a rhythmic, hot intensity that matched the pulse of the station's core. "Eyes up, everyone," Elias grunted, his voice echoing in the hollow tube. He had Pip strapped into a tactical carrier on his chest, the toddler's small hands gripping the front of Elias's vest. "We are entering the neutral buffer. The sensors are erratic here, but that works for us as much as them. Lyra, how is the signal looking?" Lyra was 10 meters above him, her boots finding purchase on a series of protruding, copper cooling fins. She didn't look back as she tapped the side of her datapad. The ghost logic is screaming, Dad. We are passing through the interference layer of the primary graviton stabilizers. My HUD is showing a dozen false heat signatures. It's like the station is trying to trick us into thinking we're being followed by ghosts. Maybe we are, Kaelin muttered from below Elias. The Leonian warrior was the rear guard, her golden eyes scanning the darkness they had just left. Her fur was matted with the gray dust of the marrow, but her posture was as sharp as a honed blade. The marrow has a way of holding on to memories. My people say that when a star leviathan dies, its last thoughts get trapped in the bone. Down here, you aren't just climbing a station. You're climbing a mind. Let's hope that mind isn't in a bad mood today, Elias said. He pulled himself up another meter, his muscles screaming. Vanya, how are the kits? Vanya was sandwiched between Kaelin and Elias, helping the three Leonian kits navigate the treacherous terrain. They are tired, Elias. Tali is shivering, and Ren's arm needs a fresh dressing. We cannot stay in the shaft for long. The oxygen levels are dropping as the pressure seals above us compensate for the eye socket breach. Almost there, Elias promised, though his own lungs felt like they were full of needles. 20 more meters to the maintenance hatch. There should be a sanctuary there. An old friend of mine, a smuggler named Silas, runs a scrap depot in the buffer. He owes me a life debt from the war. He'll give us a place to catch our breath before we hit the archive. A smuggler? Kaelin's voice was dripping with suspicion. You're trusting the lives of these cubs to a man who sells junk for a living? Silas is a void walker, Elias replied, using the street slang for those who lived in the unmapped crevices of the station. He's a man who has screwed the pooch more times than I can count, but he has a code. He was the one who pulled me out of the wreckage in Sector 4 when everyone else had written us off as KIA. He's solid. In this world, Elias, solid can melt if the price is high enough, Vanya said softly. Elias didn't answer. He couldn't afford to let doubt seep in. He had to believe in something, or the weight of the 5 children behind him would crush him before they reached the top. He reached the hatch first, a heavy circular plate of reinforced iron. He tapped a complex sequence into the manual override, a code he hadn't used in 3 years. The hatch groaned, its rusted hinges protesting as it swung open. A blast of warm, dry air hit Elias, smelling of ozone, grease, and cheap synthetic tobacco. Welcome to the scrap heap, a gravelly voice announced from the darkness above. Elias climbed through the opening, helping Lyra and the children up after him. They emerged into a vast, cluttered warehouse filled with the detritus of a century's worth of space travel. Rusted engine blocks, stacks of decommissioned droids, and mountains of tangled copper wiring created a labyrinth of shadows. Standing in the center of the room was a man who looked like he was made of the same scrap he sold. Silas was tall and thin, his skin the color of old parchment, with a cybernetic eye that whirred as it focused on the group. Elias Thorne, Silas said, a crooked grin spreading across his face. I heard the station comms going crazy about a certain medic who decided to go rogue. They say you kidnapped a whole pride of cats and a couple of humans. I figured it was only a matter of time before you crawled into my hole. We're not staying, Silas, Elias said, unstrapping Pip and setting the toddler on a pile of thermal blankets. We need a rest cycle and a clear path to the Starfall archive. The erasers are right on our 6. Silas whistled, his cybernetic eye spinning. The archive? That's high altitude, Elias. Vane has the whole sector on lockdown. You're asking for a one-way ticket to a black site. These kids don't look like they're ready for a heavy gravity firefight. They're tougher than they look, Elias said, walking over to Silas. He lowered his voice. I'm cashing in, Silas. The life debt. I need you to ghost our signatures for 6 hours. Just long enough for the children to sleep and for me to patch them up. Silas looked past Elias at the children. He saw Nova helping the Leonian kits find water, and Lyra obsessively checking her datapad for pursuit drones. He saw the bruises, the exhaustion, and the quiet, haunting terror in their eyes. They're just specimens to Vane, Elias, Silas said, his voice losing its playful edge. You know that. You're fighting a gravity well. You can't stop the fall. I'm a doctor, Silas, Elias replied. I don't stop the fall. I just make sure the landing doesn't kill them. Are you in or out? Silas was silent for a long moment, the whirring of his mechanical eye the only sound in the room. Finally, he nodded. The back room has a shielded perimeter and 4 cots. There's a med station with some basic supplies. I'll run a decoy signal through the marrow loops to lead the trackers toward the smelting vats. But Elias, if they find you here, I can't protect you. I'm just a junk man. I know, Elias said. Thank you. The next 4 hours were a blur of antiseptic and low-whispered conversations. Elias worked with a silent, focused intensity, his hands moving with the grace of 2 decades of experience. He cleaned the plasma burns on Kalen's shoulder, stitched the shallow gash on Ren's arm, and administered a mild sedative to the younger kits to help them sleep through the nightmares. As he finished bandaging Ren, the boy looked up at him, his golden pupils dilated in the dim light. Dr. Elias, why is that man with the shiny eye helping us? Does he want the file too? Elias paused, his fingers lingering on the bandage. He's helping us because we're friends, Ren. In the void, sometimes that's the only thing that matters. But we aren't his family, Ren said. Why would he risk getting zeroed for people he doesn't know? Elias looked at the boy, then at the rest of the group. Lyra was curled up on a crate, her head resting on her backpack, finally asleep. Kalen and Vanya were standing guard at the door, their silhouettes sharp against the blue glow of the warehouse's emergency lights. Because family isn't just about who you're born to, kid, Elias said softly. It's about who you choose to stand with when the lights go out. Silas is choosing to stand with us. That makes him part of the pack, at least for tonight. Ren seemed to consider this, then nodded and drifted off to sleep. Elias stood up, his bones aching. He walked over to the med station to wash his hands, but his eyes caught a flickering screen on Silas's desk. It was a private comm channel, encrypted with a high-level corporate signature. Elias felt a cold prickle of alarm. He moved closer, his breath catching. The screen displayed a series of bank transfers, each one amounting to 50,000 credits. The sender was an anonymous account, but the recipient was clear, Silas Jackson. The most recent transfer had been logged only 30 minutes ago. The subject line of the message read, "Specimen location confirmed, extraction team en route." Elias's blood turned to ice. He didn't have time to process the betrayal, to feel the sting of a friendship sold for a handful of credits. He spun around, his hand reaching for the heavy wrench on the table. "Silas!" Elias roared. But the warehouse was already changing. The lights shifted from a soft amber to a harsh, strobing red. The magnetic locks on the doors hissed shut, the heavy iron plates slamming into place with the finality of a coffin lid. Silas stepped out from behind a mountain of scrap, his cybernetic eye glowing a bright, aggressive crimson. He was holding a pulse rifle, the barrel aimed directly at Elias's chest. "I'm sorry, Elias," Silas said, his voice shaking. "Truly I am. But Vane offered me more than just credits. He offered me a way out, a ticket to the core. No more scrap, no more breathing recycled bone dust. I'm 60 years old, Elias. I'm tired of the void." "You sold the kids, Silas," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You sold my daughter." "She's a human, Elias." "Vane said she'd be safe," Silas shouted, his grip tightening on the rifle. "He just wants the Leonians. He said they're just biological assets. He'll take them back to the lab, and you and Lyra can walk away with enough money to buy a moon." "You think I'd take his money?" Elias stepped forward, ignoring the rifle. "You think I'd let him turn these children into a blood bank?" "Stop walking, Elias. I don't want to zero you." From the back room, the children were waking up, their cries of confusion mixing with the wail of the warehouse sirens. Kalen and Vanya were already at the door, but the magnetic shield Silas had triggered was a high-grade military field. They were trapped. "Look at them, Silas," Elias yelled, pointing to the room where the kids were huddled. "Look at Nova. Look at Ren. Are those assets to you? Is that what you see when you look at a child? A paycheck?" "They're not human," Silas screamed, his cybernetic eye whirring frantically. "The universe is a meat grinder, Elias. We all get chewed up eventually. I'm just trying to make sure I'm the one doing the chewing for once." "Then you've already lost your soul," Elias said. The floor of the warehouse shook as a heavy transport skiff docked with the external airlock. The sound of mag boots on metal echoed through the hull. The erasers were here. "Silas, open the door," Elias pleaded, his voice dropping into a desperate whisper. Don't do this. You can still choose. You can be the man who pulled me out of the wreckage, or you can be the man who put these children in a cage. Which one is going to be your legacy? Silas stared at Elias, his finger twitching on the trigger. He looked at the bank transfers on his screen, then at the door where the Leonian kits were staring at him with wide golden eyes. For a second, the junk man's face softened, the greed warring with a flicker of the man he used to be. I can't, Silas whispered. The airlock exploded. A wave of concussive force threw Elias backward into a stack of droids. Through the smoke, 6 erasers burst into the room, their plasma rifles leveled. They didn't look at Silas. They didn't look at Elias. They moved with mechanical efficiency toward the back room. Secure the assets, the lead eraser commanded. Silas stood frozen, his pulse rifle hanging limp in his hand. He looked at the armored soldiers, then at Elias, who was struggling to stand. What have I done? Silas whispered. Kalen, Vanya, Elias screamed. Break the field, now! The Leonian warriors slammed their bodies against the magnetic shield, their claws sparking against the blue energy. But it was too strong. The erasers reached the children, their gloved hands grabbing Ren and Tali. No! Nova shouted, throwing herself at a soldier's leg. The eraser backhanded her with a casual, brutal force that sent the 8-year-old girl flying across the room. She hit a pile of scrap and lay still. Something inside Elias Thorne finally snapped. It wasn't the anger of a soldier or the frustration of a medic. It was the primal, visceral rage of a father. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the station's grid. Lyra, override the warehouse power, Elias yelled. Lyra, who had been hiding under a desk, lunged for Silas's console. Her fingers moved with a speed that blurred, her technopathic intuition guiding her through the layers of corporate encryption. I'm in, Lyra screamed. Dad, if I blow the capacitors, the whole sector goes dark. Do it! Lyra slammed her hand onto the screen. The warehouse didn't just go dark. It erupted. The electrical capacitors, overloaded by Lyra's feedback loop, exploded in a sequence of blue-white flashes. The magnetic shield sputtered and died. The stroboscopic red lights vanished, replaced by an absolute suffocating darkness. In the void, the erasers were blind. Their thermal optics were scrambled by the electrical interference, their HUDs flickering with static. But the Leonians didn't need lights. Hunt them, Kalen's voice purred from the shadows. Elias heard the wet tear of flesh, the mechanical grunt of a soldier falling, and the rhythmic thump-thump of Kalen and Vanya moving through the dark like smoke. He scrambled toward Nova, his hands finding her in the wreckage. Nova? Can you hear me? Elias whispered, his hands checking her pulse. I'm okay, Nova wheezed, her voice small. Get Pip. They've got Pip. Elias looked up. In the faint flickering light of a dying battery, he saw an eraser carrying the toddler toward the airlock. Silas, Elias roared, use the rifle. Silas was standing by the airlock, his cybernetic eye the only light in the room. He looked at the eraser, then at the toddler in the soldier's arms. He looked at the bank transfer notification that was still blinking on his datapad, the price of his soul. I'm a void walker, Silas whispered to himself, and the void doesn't forget. Silas raised his pulse rifle and fired. The shot didn't hit the soldier. It hit the airlock's manual release. The heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off the eraser's path to the transport skiff. Silas then turned the rifle on the soldier, a single high-output bolt of energy punching through the eraser's chest plate. The soldier fell, dropping Pip. Silas stood over the toddler, his rifle leveled at the remaining erasers, who were being systematically dismantled by Kalen and Vanya in the shadows. The deal is off, Silas screamed, his voice breaking. Get out of my shop. Get out of my sector. The remaining 3 erasers, realizing they were outmatched in the dark and cut off from their transport, retreated through a secondary vent. The warehouse fell into a tense, heavy silence. The only sound was the crackle of burning wiring and Pip's soft whimpering. Elias stood up, carrying Nova in his arms. He walked toward Silas. The junk man was trembling, his cybernetic eye flickering with a dim, dying light. He looked at Elias, then dropped the rifle. I'm sorry, Elias, Silas whispered. I almost sold them. You didn't, Elias said, his voice rough. He looked at the bank transfers on the screen. Delete the credits, Silas. They're blood money. Silas nodded and swiped his hand across the console, wiping the account. Vane will be back. He'll send a full battalion next time. You have to get to the archive now. There's a secret lift behind the engine stacks. It leads directly to the data hubs. Are you coming with us? Lyra asked, stepping out from the shadows. Silas shook his head. I have to stay and clean up the mess. I'll jam the sensors for as long as I can. But Elias, if you make it through this, tell Sarah she was right. You are the match. Elias reached out and gripped Silas's hand. Stay alive, you old dust-eater. I'll try, Silas said. Now move, before the backup generators kick in. They ran. They disappeared into the secret lift, leaving Silas alone in his warehouse of broken things. As the lift began its ascent toward the Starfall archive, Elias looked at the group. They were battered, betrayed, and bleeding, but they were still together. The lesson was beginning to take hold. Family wasn't a sanctuary you were born into. It was a fortress you built, one brick of trust at a time, and Silas had just provided the foundation. Elias Thorne checked the charge on his surgical laser. They were heading for the heart of the enemy, and this time he wasn't just bringing medicine, he was bringing the truth. The Starfall Archive was a cathedral of light in a station built of bone. Located at the very apex of the ossuary structure, it was a massive geodesic dome made of transparent crystalline carbon, offering a panoramic view of the Golden Nebula. Inside, towering pillars of blue light stretched from the floor to the ceiling, each one containing millions of petabytes of data encoded into the very atoms of the glowing gas. It was silent, clinical, and terrifyingly beautiful. Elias stepped out of the maintenance lift, his boots clicking against the polished obsidian floor. He was carrying Pip, while Nova and the Leonian kits huddled close to Kaelin and Vanya. Lyra was at the front, her datapad out, her eyes darting between the data pillars as if she were reading a language only she could see. We're in the primary hub, Lyra whispered. Dad, this place is incredible. I can feel the data. It's like 1,000 voices all whispering at once. Keep your head in the game, Lyra, Elias warned. He scanned the room. The archive appeared empty, but he knew better. Vane wouldn't leave his most valuable asset unguarded. Where's the broadcast terminal? Center of the dome, Kaelin said, pointing to a raised platform beneath the crystalline roof. But there's a localized interference field around it. Vane has the whole archive on a private loop. We can't just plug in and play. We need a hard link override. I can do it, Lyra said, already moving toward the platform. But I'll need at least 10 minutes of uninterrupted access. If the erasers hit us now, I won't be able to hold the connection. You'll have your 10 minutes, Elias said. He looked at Kaelin and Vanya. Perimeter defense, use the data pillars as cover. They're reinforced with graviton shields. Plasma won't punch through. And you, Elias? Vanya asked, checking the charge on her pulse pistol. I'm the carrier, Elias said, tapping the data crystal in his pocket. I have to stay with Lyra. The protocol won't broadcast without my biometric signature. As they moved toward the center of the dome, the air suddenly grew cold. A holographic projection shimmered into existence on the platform, blocking their path. It wasn't Sarah this time. It was a man, High Proctor Vane. He looked exactly as he did in the news feeds, impeccably dressed in a white corporate uniform, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. His expression one of polite, detached boredom. But up close, Elias could see the coldness in his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who looked at the universe and saw only a balance sheet. Dr. Thorne, the hologram said, its voice smooth and resonant. I must say I am impressed. I had anticipated that Silas would have resolved this little complication hours ago. It seems the junk man still harbors a spark of sentimentality, a fatal flaw in this sector. Silas has a conscience, Vane, Elias said, stepping forward, something you wouldn't know anything about. Conscience is a luxury for the stagnant, Elias, Vane replied, clasping his hands behind his back. I am building a future, a world where human frailty is a thing of the past. Imagine it, a century of health, of progress, of order. All it costs is the genetic material of 5 biological anomalies, a small price to pay for the immortality of the species. They're children, Elias shouted, his voice echoing off the crystalline dome. They're not anomalies. They're people who laugh and cry and feel pain. You want to build your future on a mountain of corpses. I am a realist, Elias, Vane said, his image flickering slightly. And the reality is that you are cornered. My extraction team is already in the archive. You have two choices. You hand over the specimens and the data crystal, and I allow you and your daughter to leave the station on a private shuttle. You will have more credits than you can spend in 3 lifetimes. Or, you die here, and I take what I want anyway. Elias looked at Lyra. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the defiance. He looked at Nova, who was holding Ren's hand, her face set in a mask of stubborn courage. You're wrong about one thing, Vane, Elias said, his voice quiet but steady. And what is that? You think this is about credits and specimens. You think it's about a deal. Elias pulled the data crystal from his pocket and held it up. But it's about family, and you don't trade family for a ticket out. Vane's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed. Sentimentality again. It truly is the human plague. Very well, Dr. Thorne. Have it your way. The hologram vanished. From the shadows of the data pillars, 12 erasers emerged. They weren't the standard contractors they had faced in the warehouse. These were Vane's elite guard, armored in heavy black carbon fiber plating and carrying long-range rail rifles. Contact! Kalen screamed. The archive erupted into a symphony of destruction. Plasma bolts and rail slugs hissed through the air, shattering the obsidian floor and scorching the glowing data pillars. Kalen and Vanya moved like ghosts, their Leonian reflexes allowing them to weave through the fire as they returned shots from their pulse pistols. Lyra, go! Elias yelled. He grabbed Lyra by the waist and hauled her onto the raised platform. They dived behind the central terminal just as a rail slug punched through the air where their heads had been a second ago. I need the crystal, Dad, Lyra shouted over the roar of the firefight. Elias handed her the legacy protocol. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. He looked out over the railing. Kalen and Vanya were pinned down behind a data pillar 20 meters away. The erasers were flanking them, moving with a disciplined, cold precision. We're getting zeroed out here, Thorne, Kalen yelled, her voice barely audible over the sirens. They have too much firepower. We need a diversion. Elias looked at the terminal. It wasn't just a broadcast unit. It was the heart of the archive's environmental controls. Lyra, can you vent the coolant from the data pillars? Elias asked. The liquid nitrogen? Lyra's eyes widened. Dad, if I do that, the floor will flash freeze. The archive will become an icebox in seconds. The Leonians have thicker fur and better grip, Elias said. The erasers are in heavy, smooth-soled boots. Give them a skating rink. Lyra grinned. On it! She bypassed the safety locks and slammed her thumb into the manual override. A high-pitched hiss filled the dome as the data pillars began to vent clouds of supercooled nitrogen. The gas swirled across the floor, and within seconds a layer of thick, black ice covered the obsidian surface. The erasers, caught mid-advance, lost their footing. Their heavy boots had no traction on the frozen surface, and they began to slip and slide, their formation breaking into a chaotic mess of flailing limbs. Kalen and Vanya didn't miss the chance. Using their claws for grip, they skated across the ice with terrifying speed. They were no longer soldiers, they were predators. They tore through the eraser lines, their vibro blades carving through armor and flesh with a rhythmic, brutal efficiency. But more erasers were pouring in from the upper gantries. Dad, I've got the hard link, Lyra screamed. But the system is asking for the biometric key. It needs your pulse. Elias crawled to the interface and placed his hand on the glowing sensor. Elias Thorne, primary guardian candidate, execute broadcast. The terminal hummed, the blue light turning a brilliant, blinding white. A massive data stream began to climb up the central pillar, reaching for the geodesic dome. Data transfer, 2%. It's too slow, Lyra cried out. They're going to hit the terminal before we finish. From the gantry above, an eraser raised a heavy grenade launcher. He aimed directly at the terminal, directly at Lyra. Elias saw it happening in slow motion. He saw the soldier's fingers squeeze the trigger. He saw the grenade launch, a small black projectile of certain death. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. Elias threw himself over Lyra, his body acting as a human shield. The explosion was a roar of heat and light. The terminal shattered, and Elias was thrown backward, his world spinning into a haze of gray and red. He felt a sharp, agonizing pain in his back, the heat of the blast searing through his tactical vest. "Dad!" Lyra's voice was a scream from a great distance. Elias lay on the floor, gasping for air. He could taste blood in his mouth. He looked up at the crystalline dome. Above him, the golden nebula swirled in a beautiful, indifferent dance of colors. He looked at the terminal. It was smoking. Half of the interface melted away. Did it finish?" Elias wheezed. Lyra was hovering over him, her face covered in soot and tears. She looked at her datapad. 98%, Dad. It stopped at 98%. The terminal is dead." The archive grew quiet. The erasers had stopped firing, their orders fulfilled. Vane's holographic image reappeared on the platform, looking down at Elias with a pitying smile. "So close, Dr. Thorne," Vane said. "A valiant effort. But in the end, your sentimentality was your undoing. You saved the girl, but you lost the message. And now, I take them all." Kaylin and Vanya were being surrounded by the remaining soldiers, their weapons empty, their bodies exhausted. The children were huddled together in the corner, Nova shielding Pip with her own body. Vane walked toward the children, his hand reaching for Nova. "Don't touch her," Elias groaned, struggling to push himself up. His back felt like it was on fire, but he refused to stay down. "You are a ghost, Elias," Vane said, not even looking back. "A remnant of a dead era. The future belongs to those who are willing to sacrifice others, not themselves." Elias looked at the children. He saw the terror in Nova's eyes, the way Ren was trembling, and the way Pip was crying for a father who was bleeding on the floor. And then he remembered the lesson. Family wasn't just about protection. It wasn't just about sacrifice. It was about the choice to never let go, no matter how hard the universe tried to tear you apart. Elias looked at his wrist. Sarah's watch was still ticking, the analog key Silas had mentioned. He realized then that the terminal wasn't the only way to broadcast. The legacy protocol was designed to be resilient. It was designed to find a match. "Lyra," Elias whispered, grabbing her hand. "The watch. It's an analog bridge. Link your pad to my pulse. Use the watch as a resonator." Lyra's eyes widened. "Dad, if I do that, the feedback will go through your nervous system. It'll stop your heart." "Do it," Elias said, his voice a growl. "Broadcast the truth, Lyra. Let the whole sector see him for what he is." "I can't lose you." "You're not losing me," Elias said, a faint smile touching his lips. "I'm just delivering the medicine. Now do it." Lyra hesitated for a single agonizing second, then nodded. She snapped the cable from her pad into the back of the watch and placed the other end against Elias's temple. "I love you, Dad," she whispered. "I love you too," Elias said. "Now, pull the trigger." Lyra hit the command. A massive surge of bioelectrical energy punched through Elias Thorne's body. His world exploded into a blinding white light. He could feel the data, Sarah's voice, the images of the war, the records of the Ethelgard project, flowing through his veins, out of his heart, and into the air. The geodesic dome didn't just broadcast, it screamed. Across the entire ossuary, on every hollow screen in the core worlds, and on every ship in the Golden Nebula, the image of High Proctor Vane appeared. But it wasn't the man they knew. It was the monster Sarah had recorded. The evidence of the murders, the genetic harvesting, and the industrial-scale cruelty flooded the grid. Vane froze, his hand inches from Nova. He looked up at the dome, his face pale as he watched his own fall being broadcast to 1 billion people. "No!" Vane shrieked. "Shut it down! Kill them all!" But the soldiers didn't move. They were staring at the screens, at the reality of the man they were fighting for. The mask was off. The order was broken. Elias felt his heart stop. He felt the coldness of the void rushing in to claim him. But as he began to fall into the darkness, he saw one last thing. He saw Kaylin and Vanya rushing toward him. He saw Nova and the kits running to his side. And he saw Lyra holding his hand, her face lit up by the light of the truth. He had made his choice. He had stood with his family. And for the first time in 5 years, Elias Thorne was at peace. The archive went silent. The blue lights of the data pillars flickered and died. Elias Thorne lay still on the obsidian floor, the broken watch on his wrist finally stopping. He had delivered the message. He had protected the pack. And in the silence of the dome, the transformation was complete. The medic had become the hero, and the stranger had become the father. But as the peacekeepers' sirens began to wail in the distance, a new question hung in the air. What happens when the hero doesn't wake up? The silence that followed the broadcast was not a lack of sound, but an absence of hope for the man standing in the center of the debris. High Proctor Vane looked at his hands, then at the glowing screens surrounding the Starfall Archive dome, where his legacy was crumbling into millions of pixels of digital shame. The data stream had been absolute, across every sector of the convergence, from the high-rises of the core to the deepest ore mines of the frontier. The truth was screaming. Sarah Thorne's ghost had not just spoken, she had roared. "Dad!" Lyra's voice was a thin thread of terror. Elias Thorne lay on the cold obsidian floor, his body smoking faintly from the massive bioelectrical surge. His eyes were open, staring at the crystalline ceiling, but the sapphire blue light that usually indicated life was gone. He was a statue of scorched leather and graying skin. "He's flatlined," Kaylin hissed. She didn't wait for a medical scanner. She dropped to her knees beside Elias, her powerful Leonian hands ripping away the remains of his tactical vest. "Vanya, get the kits back. Lyra, I need the crash kit from his bag. Now!" The feedback stopped his heart, Vanya said, her golden eyes clouded with a grief that felt centuries old. She gathered the 5 children into a protective circle, shielding them from the sight of the man who had just traded his life for theirs. He took the full resonance of the lattice. No human can survive that kind of synaptic load. "He's not just a human," Lyra screamed, her fingers trembling as she threw the medical bag toward Kaylin. "He's my father! Elias, you stubborn old mule, wake up! You don't get to leave me twice." Kaylin didn't argue. She knew the medical protocols Elias had taught her during their brief time in the Marrow. She placed her palms over his chest, her Leonian strength carefully measured. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of her hands hitting his chest echoed through the dome, a desperate, artificial rhythm in the face of the void. Vane moved then, his face twisting into a mask of pathetic, cornered rage. He reached for a fallen plasma pistol, his eyes fixed on the children. "It doesn't matter," Vane rasped, his voice cracking. "The data is out, but the assets are still here. I will take them to the deep belt. I will start again." He never finished the sentence. Nova, the 8-year-old girl who had been quiet for so long, stepped forward. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have armor. She just had the fierce, cold clarity of a child who had seen too much. She looked at Vane, her eyes reflecting the swirling colors of the golden nebula. "You aren't a proctor anymore," Nova said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You're just a man who's afraid of the dark." A single shot rang out, but it didn't come from Vane. A squad of peacekeepers in cobalt blue armor burst through the upper gantries, their rail rifles leveled. The lead officer, a woman with a scar across her nose that suggested a long history in the neutral zones, didn't hesitate. She fired a stun slug that hit Vane squarely in the chest. The High Proctor crumpled, his dreams of immortality ending in a heap of white corporate fabric on the frozen floor. "Secure the area," the officer barked. "Get those children to the medical transport, and someone get a doctor over here." "I am the doctor," Lyra shouted, pushing past a soldier who tried to hold her back. She knelt by her father, her datapad already linked to the remaining sensors in his wrist unit. His heart is in ventricular fibrillation. The surge scrambled his pacing. "Kaylin, keep the rhythm. I'm going to use the internal stimulants." Elias felt the darkness as a warm, heavy blanket. It was easy here. There was no pain, no smell of ozone, no sound of sirens. He could see Sarah. She wasn't a hologram anymore. She was standing in a field of tall, blue grass under a sun that never set. She was smiling, her hand held out to him. "You did it, Elias," she whispered. "The pack is safe." "I'm tired, Sarah," Elias thought. "I've been running for 5 years. I just want to sit down." "I know," she said. "But look at the rhythm. Look at what you started." Elias looked back, through the veil of the darkness. He didn't see the war or the death. He saw Ren, the Leonian Kit holding Nova's hand. He saw Kaelin, the warrior who had spent her life as a solitary predator, now fighting like a mother to keep his heart beating. He saw Lyra, the daughter he had tried to protect by being a ghost, now standing as a beacon of fire and intelligence. He realized then that Sarah hadn't sent him a mission to die for. She had sent him a reason to live. She hadn't chosen him as a martyr. She had chosen him as the anchor. If he stayed in the darkness, the pack would survive, but they would be broken. They needed more than a victory. They needed him. The first gasp of air felt like swallowing broken glass. Elias's chest arched as his heart lunged back into its natural rhythm. His eyes snapped open, the sapphire blue of the archive's light flooding his vision. He coughed, a ragged, wet sound that made Kaelin let out a sob of relief. "Welcome back, you idiot," Kaelin whispered, her forehead resting against his shoulder for a single fleeting second before she regained her tactical composure. "Dad!" Lyra collapsed against his side, her tears hot against his neck. "Don't ever do that again. I'll scrap every piece of tech in this station if you do that again." Elias tried to speak, but his throat felt like it had been scrubbed with sand. He reached out, his hand trembling, and found Lyra's arm. He squeezed it, a silent promise that he wasn't going anywhere. The peacekeepers moved in, but they were gentle now. They helped Elias onto a hovering stretcher, their rifles slung over their backs. The officer with the scarred nose walked over to the children, who were huddled together by the broadcast terminal. "Are you the ones from the file?" she asked, her voice softening. Nova stepped forward, holding Pip by the hand. "We're the family," she said, "and we want to go with him." The officer looked at the bleeding, scorched man on the stretcher, then at the ragtag group of aliens and humans. She nodded. "Transport them together. Sector 9 Medical Hub, Priority 1. The journey back through the ossuary was a blur of lights and muffled voices. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, but every time he woke, he felt a small hand touching his arm or heard the soft purr of a Leonian Kit nearby. The station felt different. The erasers were gone, replaced by the chaotic, hopeful noise of a people who had just been handed their freedom. In the medical hub, Elias was placed in a high-pressure healing tank, the nutrient-rich fluid soothing his burns and repairing the damage to his nervous system. Through the glass, he watched as the children were given food and clean clothes. He saw Damien, his old mechanic friend, limping into the room with a crate of fresh fruit and a wide, crooked grin. "I told you I wasn't babysitting on the weekends, Thorne," Damien shouted through the glass, his voice booming in the quiet room. "You better get out of that jar soon. The kids are currently trying to disassemble the hospital's cleaning droid." Elias smiled. It was a slow, painful movement, but it felt real. 2 days later, the biological containment order was officially rescinded by the High Council. The children were granted sanctuary status under the newly established Sarah Thorne Heritage Act. They were no longer specimens, they were citizens. Kaelin and Vanya stood in the doorway of Elias's recovery room, looking cleaner than he had ever seen them. Their fur had been brushed, and they wore the simple gray tunics of station residents. "The council offered us a military commission," Kaelin said, her golden eyes fixed on the window overlooking the nebula. "They want us to lead the new security detail for the Marrow." Elias felt a pang of worry. "Are you going to take it?" Kaelin looked at Vanya, then at Elias. A sharp, dangerous smile touched her lips. "We told them we already had a commander, a stubborn, human medic who doesn't know when to quit." "We're staying, Elias," Vanya said, her tail flicking with a sense of peace he hadn't seen before. "The kids need a pride, and apparently Lyra needs someone to make sure she doesn't spend 24 hours a day staring at a data screen." "I heard that!" Lyra shouted from the corner, where she was showing Ren how to hack a nutrient dispenser. Elias leaned back against the pillows, the warmth of the room filling the spaces where the grief used to live. He looked at the children, the 5 small lives that had crashed into his quiet world and set it on fire. He had spent years trying to fix the past, thinking that he was the only one who could carry the weight of Sarah's death. But as he watched Ren and Nova argue over the last orange donut, he realized that he wasn't carrying the weight anymore. He was sharing it. The pack was the medicine he had never known he needed. "Elias?" Nova walked over to the bed, her eyes searching his. "Are we going to go back to the clinic? To the jars and the lizards?" Elias reached out and ruffled her hair. No, Nova. We're going to build something better. A place for everyone. No more hiding in the marrow. With donuts? Pip asked, climbing onto the foot of the bed. With all the donuts you can eat, kid, Elias promised. As the sun of the Golden Nebula began to set, casting a long, amber glow through the medical hub, Elias Thorne finally let go of the ghost. He wasn't Sarah's widower. He wasn't the veteran of the border wars. He was a father. He was a protector. And for the first time in 5 years, the rhythm of his heart was entirely his own. The battle for the archive was over, but the story of the pack was just beginning. And as Elias closed his eyes to rest, he knew that the next chapter would be the loudest, messiest, and most beautiful one yet. 3 months had passed since the Starfall Archive dome had screamed the truth across the sector. The ossuary, once a silent monument to a dead Leviathan, was now a place of frantic, chaotic rebirth. The upper docks were no longer patrolled by the gray-armored erasers of High Proctor Vane. Instead, peacekeepers in cobalt and gold stood guard over a station that had become a crossroads for refugees and dreamers. Elias Thorne stood on the balcony of his new clinic, located on the outer ring of the eye socket sector. It was a massive, sun-drenched space that Sarah would have loved. The walls weren't ivory bone anymore. They were covered in living, bioluminescent vines that Elias had brought up from the marrow. The scent of ozone had been replaced by the sweet, earthy smell of the terrariums where he kept his patients. The sign above the door didn't just say Thorne Veterinary Services. It had been repainted in bold, colorful letters. Thorne and Pack. Multi-species healing and refuge. Dad, the shipment of nutrient paste is 3 hours late, Lyra shouted from the cargo bay. She was wearing a grease-stained jumpsuit, her datapad tucked into a holster at her hip. She looked older, her face losing the sharp edges of trauma and gaining the confident glow of a leader. I'm going to call the freighter captain and tell him if he doesn't land in 10 minutes, I'll remotely lock his landing gear. Don't threaten the suppliers, Lyra, Elias called back, though he couldn't hide the grin on his face. Just tell them we have 5 hungry kits and a very grumpy Leonian warrior waiting for those donuts. I heard that, Kaylin's voice echoed from the exam room. She walked out onto the balcony, wiping her hands on a towel. She had traded her tactical armor for a simple, reinforced medic's vest. She looked at Elias, her golden eyes reflecting the swirling light of the nebula. Vanya is taking the kids to the observation deck for their history lesson. Apparently, Wren thinks the station was built by giant space cats, and she's trying to correct the record. Let him believe it, Elias said, leaning against the railing. It's a better story than the truth. The truth is doing just fine, Elias, Kaylin said. She stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his, a gesture of Leonian solidarity that he had come to cherish. The Council has officially dismantled the Ethelgard project. The other children, the ones Vane was holding in the Deep Belt, are being moved to the new sanctuary on Velonis Prime. They're safe because of you. Because of us, Elias corrected. He looked down at his wrist. The old watch, the analog key that had belonged to Sarah, was still there. He had repaired the face, but he had never restarted the mechanism. It remained frozen at the time the broadcast had finished, a silent monument to the moment the past died and the future began. The sound of laughter erupted from the clinic's interior. Nova and Ash were chasing a small, 6-legged lizard that had escaped its enclosure, while Pip was trying to use a medical scanner to find ghosts in the pantry. It was loud. It was messy, and it was exactly what Elias had been afraid of for 5 years. He had spent so much time in the silence, thinking that the lack of noise meant he was safe. He had thought that by cutting himself off from the world, he was protecting himself from the pain of another loss. But as he watched the children play, he realized that the silence hadn't been safety. It had been a slow, quiet death. He looked at the nebula, the golden clouds swirling in a dance that had lasted for millions of years. He realized that the universe didn't care about his grief. It didn't care about his war or his medals. It only cared about what he did with the time he had left. Sarah had known that. She hadn't sent him the children to give him a burden. She had sent them to give him a pulse. Elias walked back into the clinic, the rhythmic thump-thump of his boots on the floor sounding like a heartbeat. He stopped at the primary data terminal, where a small holographic image of Sarah flickered. It wasn't the echo from the archive. It was a simple, private recording he had found in the hidden layers of the protocol. In the video, Sarah was sitting in the cockpit of her shuttle, looking tired but happy. "Hey, Elias," she said, her voice a soft whisper in the bustling room. "If you're watching this, it means you chose them. It means you decided that the world was still worth fighting for. Don't be too hard on yourself for being slow to catch on. You always were a bit stubborn." She laughed, a sound that made the hair on Elias's arm stand up. "Just remember, healing isn't just about medicine. It's about being there for the next breath. Take care of our pack, soldier. I'll see you in the stars." The video looped back to the beginning. Elias reached out and touched the screen, his fingers tracing the outline of her smile. "We're doing okay, Sarah," he whispered. He turned back to the room. Lyra was arguing with a delivery droid, Kaylin was prepping a tray of surgical tools, and the 5 children were currently piled on a single beanbag chair, watching a hollow vid of a space whale migration. Elias Thorne, the man who had spent 5 years as a ghost, walked over to the beanbag and sat down on the floor beside them. Ren immediately crawled onto his lap, followed by Pip, who used Elias's shoulder as a pillow. "Are we going to fix the owl today, Dr. Elias?" Ren asked, his golden eyes wide with curiosity. "After lunch, Ren," Elias said. "The owl needs its rest, and so do you." "I'm not tired," Ren protested, even as his eyes began to droop. "That's what your father always says," Vanya noted, walking in with a tray of nutrient shakes. The word hit Elias with a physical force. Father. He had been a medic, a soldier, a vet, and a widower. But this was the title he had been running from. And as he looked at the children, he realized it was the only title that had ever truly mattered. The clinic was a hive of activity for the rest of the afternoon. Elias treated a series of minor injuries, a scratched ear on a Leonian kit, a metabolic imbalance in a glowing lizard, and a stubborn case of void cough in a traveler's exopet. Every time he worked, he felt the children watching him. They were learning. They were seeing that the world wasn't just a place of laboratories and liquidation orders. It was a place of care and restoration. As the second sun began to dip below the station's horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the eye socket, Elias walked out to the balcony one last time. He looked at the vast expanse of the ossuary, the millions of lights representing millions of lives, all interconnected by a fragile web of hope and choice. He had spent years thinking he was a broken thing that couldn't be fixed. He had thought that his heart was a closed circuit, fused shut by the fire of Sector 4. But the children had been the technicians. They had rewired him, one elbow in the ribs and one sticky handprint at a time. They hadn't needed a perfect hero. They had needed a man who was willing to try. He looked back on the journey, from the smoky booth at the rib cage to the frozen floor of the archive. He thought about Silas, the junk man who had found his soul in the dark. He thought about Kaylin and Vanya, who had chosen to trade their blades for bandages. And he thought about Sarah, who had seen the Father in him even when he was blind to it himself. I understand now, Elias thought. The perfect match wasn't a calculation of compatibility. It was a measure of capacity. It was the universe asking, how much room do you have in your heart for the broken things? He looked at the stars, the same stars that had seen his wife fall and his children suffer. They didn't look cold anymore. They looked like possibilities. For so long, I believed that love was a liability in a universe this harsh. I thought that by staying alone, I was keeping the grief at bay, not realizing that I was just making room for the darkness to grow. I spent 5 years waiting for a sign that it was safe to come out of the shadows, only to realize that the sign was the sound of 5 children breathing in the dark. We spend our lives looking for the perfect path, the perfect person, the perfect moment. But life isn't about perfection. It's about the messy, loud, and often terrifying choice to be responsible for someone else's heartbeat. I was a medic who forgot that the most important thing you can heal is the connection between 2 souls. I'm not the man I was 3 months ago. I'm scarred, I'm tired, and I have a grocery bill that would bankrupt a small moon. But for the first time in my life, I know exactly where I'm supposed to be. I wonder, as you look at your own world, how many people are you keeping at a distance to stay safe? And what would happen if you finally decided to let the noise in? The children's laughter drifted out from the clinic, a bright, chaotic melody that filled the evening air. Elias Thorne didn't turn back to the silence. He turned toward the noise, his heart beating in a rhythm that was no longer a ghost, but a home. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small orange nutrient cracker, the one Wren had been looking for. He looked at it, smiled, and walked back inside to join the pack. The watch on the windowsill remained still, but the time for waiting was over. I've been a ghost for so long that I forgot what it feels like to have a shadow that isn't made of grief. I used to think family was a cage, something that made you weak because it gave the world a target to hit. But standing here, in a room full of fur and noise and far too many unwashed dishes, I realize that family is the only thing that actually makes the target worth defending. It's a choice you make every single morning, even when you're tired, even when you're scared, and even when the coffee machine is acting like it wants to start a revolution. I spent 5 years looking for Sarah in the stars, but I found her in the way Nova looks at a wounded bird and the way Lyra refuses to give up on a broken circuit. We are all just a collection of fragments, aren't we? Just pieces of bone and data drifting in the void. But when we choose to stick together, we become something the universe can't ignore. We become a story. I spent years carrying that grief like armor, only to realize it was a prison. I wonder, is there a part of your life you've been shielding from the world, thinking its brokenness makes you less worthy of a pack? What would happen if you stopped waiting for the perfect match and just decided to be the one who stays? Elias Thorne turned away from the stars and closed the door, the sound of the lock clicking into place, echoing with the finality of a man who had finally found his way home. The golden nebula glowed in the distance, a silent witness to a father who had finally stopped running.